From 1988 to 1992, Superboy flew onto the small screen with a low budget and a lot of Florida scenery in the Superboy TV show, where we follow the exploits of Clark Kent in his college days at Schuster University, where he spends his time with his friends Lana Lang, TJ White, and Andy McAllister, and as Superboy must stop many dastardly plans and evil schemes, from petty crooks to larger-than-life superpowered foes, where he crosses paths with the likes of Lex Luthor and Bizarro. Now, I was a kid when this show came out and I absolutely loved it. Yep, every darn minute of it. Looking back in hindsight, it kind of has a Power Rangers meets Saved by the Bell aesthetic. And back in the day, I totally lapped it up and consumed every bit of it. So the big question is, how does this often forgotten Superman-related TV show hold up today? So, was the show actually good? Is it worth remembering? Is it worth going back and re-evaluating? Well, the answer to all three of those questions is yes! So sit back, relax, grab a snack as we explore the history of the Superboy TV show. One of the most unique and overlooked chapters in the Superman mythology. So, let's check it out. Chapter 1. Who is Superboy? Superboy goes back to the creators of Superman, comic book writers and artists Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. They created Superman for DC Comics in 1938, an exciting fictional hero who really captivated people's imaginations at the time, with Superman becoming an instant phenomenon. Not too long after the creation of Superman, co-creator Jerry Siegel proposed a comic book story to focus on young Clark Kent, to show the superpowered being from the planet Krypton growing up in Smallville, where he also saves the day as Superboy, a child version of Superman. And DC Comics said no. The idea would actually be pitched several times and DC would continue to say no. Finally, as the 1940s went on, there was now a vested interest in child superheroes, thanks to Batman's sidekick, Robin the Boy Wonder. DC were now eager to explore Superman in his childhood years, where Superboy made his first appearance in More Fun Comics issue 101 in 1944. The character would then become a regular in Adventure Comics, until he would end up with his own titled comic book. The character of Superboy became one of the most successful post-World War II comic book characters, with him being the second bestseller, and the Superboy comics would further the character developments of Ma and Pa Kent, Lana Lang, as well as giving Lex Luthor an origin story where he lost his hair in an experiment gone wrong, where he now blames Superboy. And it was the Superboy comics that introduced the characters of Krypto the Superdog and Bizarro, a strange and unusual clone of Superboy. Now, there was already an attempt to make a Superboy TV series as far back as 1961, which was to carry on after the Adventures of Superman TV show, which came to an end thanks to the passing of Superman actor George Reeves. A Superboy pilot was shot in black and white, but ultimately it didn't go anywhere and was swiftly abandoned. There was, however, a Superboy cartoon series by Filmation in 1966, which proved popular at the time. As the years went by, Superboy's popularity continued to grow, where he would feature in popular comic series Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes and the New Adventures of Superboy. Yep, Superboy had proven to be a valid asset in the DC lineup of superheroes. Chapter 2. Making the shift from movies to TV show. So we've discussed the origins of the Superboy character, but what about the TV show itself? Well, it starts with father and son producing team Elia and Alexander Solkind. Their involvement with the character goes all the way back to 1974, when they bought the rights to Superman and all Superman-related characters in order to make a Superman movie, where they would produce Superman the movie, which came out in 1978 and was a massive hit. Then in 1980, Superman 2 came out, which was also a hit. Then in 1983, Superman 3 was released, which wasn't as much of a hit. So the producers decided to turn their attention to Supergirl, with a Supergirl movie coming out in 1984. However, that movie did even worse. So the Soulkinds decided to now focus their attention onto the small screen and to produce a Superboy TV series. As the show was going into development, Canon Films bought the movie rights of Superman in order to make Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. And so because of this, for legal reasons, the name Superman could never be used in the Superboy TV show. Yep, no matter how old he looks, he's always going to be Superboy. The Soulkinds chose to film the series in Florida, namely Orlando, as the location had a sudden growth boom in the film and television industry during the 80s, which would have felt like quite the change in location, as the Superman movies were mainly filmed in England. And so the first season of the Superboy TV series was filmed at the Disneyland MGM Studios, making it the first TV series to be filmed at the studios. The show was also handled by media entertainment conglomerate Viacom. And so due to its Florida location, this is why often the background of the Superboy TV series, it looks like a really warm and sunny tropical place. Which is interesting, because usually when I think of Superman or Superboy, I either think of the busy city scenery of the metropolis or the Middle America farmland Smallville setting. This warm and sunny Florida setting definitely gives the Superboy show its own identity and look. In addition to that, the University of Central Florida would often double for the fictional Schuster University in the show. And yes, the Schuster University is named after Superman's co-creator, Joe Shuster. Now, several Superman comic book writers at that time were brought in to work on the scripts, especially writers who were writing for the Superman comics John Byrne revamp, including Mike Carlin and Dennis O'Neil, among others. This is why, unlike Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman, which came out after Superboy, the Superboy TV show felt much more like a comic book and was more action-orientated. Although there is an irony that the Superboy TV show took heavy inspiration from the John Byrne comic book revamp, because in that timeline, the concept of Superboy was deleted, with Clark becoming his super alter ego as a fully grown man. Unlike the Superboy comics, which mainly focuses on young Clark Kent / Superboy growing up on the Kent farm, the series now takes a new approach by mainly focusing the action at a college university, focusing on a teenage Clark Kent and Lana Lang, as well as TJ White, son of Perry White, a character made specifically for the show, places the main focus of the show on the three main characters working for the college newspaper, where they would investigate all manner of strange going-ons in the city of Siegelville, which of course is named after fellow Superman co-creator Jerry Siegel. Once again, this was exploring avenues we've never fully seen in the mythos before, or at least on screen. That being, of course, Clark Kent as a college student. In fact, this part of Clark's life often gets bypassed in other media. We often jump from Clark being a high school student to being a fully grown adult in Metropolis. Although, really, technically, I feel like the show isn't so much Superboy, but rather the adventures of young Superman. But once again, those copyright issues. And of course, the series was its own universe, not connected with the Christopher Reeve movies. But I would still say that it was a universe that was heavily inspired by those movies. Chapter 3: The Face of Superboy. When it came to who can fill in the teenage red boots and cape of Superboy, the Soulkinds were looking for someone who resembled Christopher Reeve and could look both heroic and nerdy. John Haymes Newton had just auditioned to star in Weekend at Bernie's, but the audition was unsuccessful. So he then decided to try out for Superboy, and it was felt that during his audition, he just had the right look and features the production were looking for. And yes, when we see him on screen in his Superboy suit, he does have a striking resemblance to Christopher Reeve. And something that I think helps this is, as pointed out by Cosplay Chris, the Superboy suit is primarily made out of materials, fabrics, and designs of the Christopher Reeve Superman suit. It's basically the same suit, minor a few adjustments and alterations. Newton did have the same sense of nobility and majestic presence as Reeve. And at 22 years old, he was cast as the teenage boy of steel of the 80s. And he did command the screen. When it came to Lana Lang, Stacey Hyduck was cast in the part. And wow, they really struck gold with her, as she was definitely the heart of the show, and brought so much compassion and likability to the role. She was really a good actress too. In fact, to a degree, she was probably a little bit too good for the show, because it's like she's starring in this really cheesy show, but she's still delivering an A-grade performance, acting for her dear life like she's starring in some Shakespearean production. And she would stay in the show through its entire 4 seasons. She also had great chemistry with Newton, but that could be because the two were dating in real life at the time of filming. Now, this first season of Superboy is interesting. I think many fans see it as the weakest link of the 4 seasons. And yes, it has its issues. In my opinion, the first couple of episodes feel like they're lacking in energy. And the show just hadn't discovered its identity yet. In those early days of the show, most of the episodes would see Superboy battling petty crooks and Lex Luthor, played by Scott James Wells, who was just really shown to be a smug, petty kid, and was kind of more of an annoyance than an actual threat. Also, I think the first season looked cheaper, probably because the production hadn't fully realised exactly how to utilise the small budget. It's like the idea is there, but it just looks a little off. Yeah, like they needed to have a little bit more practice. As the show went on, I think they really did improve the look of the show and the effects. So season 1 is really the early experimental days, the days of the show figuring itself out. Even the show's intro was just really lacking and confused, as it just shows Superboy flying over a really uninteresting view of the ocean, with poor John Hames Newton doing his best to look really impressed. However though, I do think things started to improve with the second half of season 1. The show got a new energetic title sequence, and the show also just felt more kinetic and proactive. It was starting to feel more comic book-like, with more fantastical villains showing up, including Superboy coming face to face with villainous trickster, Mr. Mxyzptlk, an iconic Superman villain that the Soul Kinds had actually been trying to incorporate into live action since Superman 3. And I do think that there were some great episodes in that first season, especially in the later days of the season. So I think that season 1 does have merit, and shouldn't just be overlooked. Just keep in mind the show hadn't been fully realised yet, so you'll see some bizarre things, like Superboy coaching a basketball team. Chapter 4: The New Face of Superboy. So with the second season of Superboy came with it a lot of changes. Firstly, in between seasons, John Hames Newton was let go as Superboy, the biggest and most drastic change the series would ever face. Now, there are tons of stories as to why Newton didn't return. In recent years, Newton has explained that a lot of the filming for the show was dangerous, and he did suffer quite a few scrapes, and apparently even nearly died on one occasion, and so he was promised more money for his work. But then the production declined, so he walked away. Simple as that. In hindsight though, he does wish that he honoured his contract, but doesn't blame anyone for the ordeal. So, 30-year-old actor Gerard Christopher auditioned to be the new Superboy, and the producers were impressed with his audition, and so he was cast and announced to the world as the new Superboy. Season 2 would also see the production shift to Universal Studios Florida. The character TJ White, who was played by James Calvert, would be replaced by a new character, Andy McAllister, played by 80s teen movie actor Elan Mitchell-Smith. A more smart-mouth wise guy character, you know, the comedic foil. As well as a new Lex Luthor, played by actor Sherman Howard, who was a huge improvement, delivering a delightfully menacing performance, and is truly an underrated Lex Luthor. Season 2 almost feels like a reboot itself. The stories are now a lot more fantastical, and it felt more like a comic book. Gerard Christopher would stay in the show till its end, and would even write and produce several episodes. So the big question is, who was the better Superboy? Well, I think that Newton was the better actor and felt more grounded and real, but I think Christopher was more entertaining. He just went with the cheesy atmosphere of the show better, like he knew he was starring in a wonderfully silly show and was just going to have fun with it. He just blended in with it better. I also like how his Clark Kent is more like the goofy, comical Christopher Reeve Clark Kent. So yeah, in my opinion, given what the show was, I found Christopher more enjoyable, but Newton's efforts should not be overlooked. And now, with this new iteration of the show, more classic villains from the comics were introduced, including Metallo, Knick-Knack, who was an obvious take on the character the Toyman, the Yellow Perry, as well as other DC characters like Brimstone. Heck, we even see Superboy go up against Dracula, because why not, I guess? To me, the real standout feature in the way of classic villains in this show is without a doubt Bizarro. I always wanted to see the character in the movies, but it never happened. His appearance in Superboy is definitely a highlight to me, and is still the best live-action Bizarro, and his makeup effects still look pretty good to this day. This is how I would have wanted Bizarro to look if he was in the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. And given that the character frequently appears throughout the show, it does often dive into the complexities of Bizarro, and you do have a lot of sympathy for the character. I think many consider Season 2 of Superboy to be a step in the right direction. However, in between Season 2 and 3, Tim Burton's Batman came out and was a huge hit. Now suddenly it was popular for superheroes to be dark and gothic, and Batman definitely changed the trajectory of the Superboy TV show, where with Season 3, the show looked darker, and felt edgier too, with a great deal of the action now being set at night, in order to make the show look more gothic, like the Batman movie. And interestingly, Season 3 once again feels like another reboot of sorts, as the show was now retitled to The Adventures of Superboy, and the Schuster College was dropped from the show, where Clark and Lana are now interns at the Bureau for Extranormal Matters, a government agency that investigates paranormal activity. Yep, a whole 3 years before X-Files. With the show now being set in dark offices, and often having a monster/supernatural occurrence of the week. Both Season 3 and 4 would follow this new darker approach to the show, and the show could actually go into dark and twisted territories, like a storyline where Superboy sort of goes into Lex Luthor's psyche and relives his twisted childhood. It's actually really disturbing. Another episode sees a slug-like alien parasite attach itself to Superboy, which causes the Boy of Steel to have horrific nightmares, in which, in his dream state, Superboy dreams that he's revealed to be a robot, and must fight Lex Luthor in a Superboy suit. Yeah, okay, that last part sounds a bit silly, but it honestly is a haunting episode. One iconic storyline in particular, involving travelling to alternate dimensions, sees Superboy finding himself in a dystopian parallel universe, and discovers an evil version of himself called the Sovereign, and another parallel Superboy with sunglasses and a leather jacket, which, yeah, many claim was the inspiration for the Superboy revamp in the comics in the 90s. This dark, edgier interpretation of the show would actually lead to an increase in its popularity, as dimly lit sets, dark, grimy alleyways, with everything covered in shadows, was increasingly replacing the sunny, tropical, colourful Florida look that was heavily used in the first 2 seasons. Chapter 5, Friends in Need. Over its 4-season run, Superboy would see many famous faces turning up as guest stars, including Roddy Piper, Gilbert Gottfried, Philip Michael Thomas, Mark Holton, Paul McCrane, a very young Joaquin Phoenix, George Chakiris, Abe Vigoda, Sybil Danning, Jay Underwood, Brian Thompson, Kari Hiroki Tagawa, and of course 1950s Lois Lane and Jimmy Olsen, Noel Neill and Jack Larson. However, when it came to guest stars, the production of Superboy sure did have a thing for actors who had appeared in James Bond movies, as the show would also feature former Bond villains Richard Kiel and Andreas Wisniewski. However, the real Bond-related guest star showstopper came in the form of a former Bond himself, George Lazenby, and former Bond girl Britt Ekland, as alien imposters pretending to be Superboy's parents, Jor-El and Lara L. They both have an amazing presence and command, and it's great seeing Superboy come face to face with James Bond. And yeah, Lazenby does an alright Jor-El. He's noble but also menacing, like this is a Jor-El you can't fully trust. Be that a Jor-El with an Australian accent. Okay, but who knows? We don't know how Kryptonians talk. Maybe they do have Australian accents. However, Lazenby's and Ekland's performances are kind of undermined and ruined when their characters turn into really cheap, crappy-looking aliens. Oh, come on, show. You had me up until that point. And of course, behind the scenes, there was also talented faces coming on board to direct the show, where we would see many acclaimed directors help bring the show to life. Some of these directors include Colin Chilvers, who had previously worked on the Rocky Horror Picture Show and Superman the movie, David Nutter, who would go on to work on Game of Thrones, Brian Spicer, who has worked on many TV shows and directed the 1995 Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie, as well as Superboy actor himself, Gerard Christopher, and the most interesting of them all, cinematic Perry White actor, Jackie Cooper, who, directed several episodes of Superboy. And of course, the Superboy TV show would also stretch into other mediums, particularly its own comic book series. So if fans couldn't wait a full week for the next episode, they could fill in their fix by seeing Superboy on the printed page. Chapter 6: End of an Era. So during its 4th season, the Superboy TV show was still going strong within its fanbase, and the Soulkinds had big plans, where the season was to end on a cliffhanger, with the audience not knowing if Superboy is still alive, of which a series of made-for-TV Superboy movies would follow, which would show that Superboy is alive and well, and the TV movies would wrap everything up, and presumably end with Superboy now becoming Superman. Yes, it sounds like the Soulkinds had an epic finale planned, one that would pay off to fans who had been following the show for 4 years now. So what happened? Well, simply put, Warner Brothers wanted to focus on making their own Superman TV series, and for it to be a reset, with the storyline based specifically on the John Byrne comic reboot, which would cancel Superboy out of existence, as in that timeline, when Clark Kent becomes Superman, he is a fully grown man. The show in question was Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman, a more adult show which mainly focuses on the romance between Lois and Superman and the office politics of Clark and Lois. Warner Brothers told the Soulkinds that their license for the Superboy character will expire in 1992, so this new show, Lois and Clark, can take place. And so, in order for that to happen, the Superboy TV show must come to an end. So the Soulkinds reworked the ending of Season 4, with everything being wrapped up in the episode Rite of Passage Part 2, which aired on May 17th, 1992. So after 4 years and 100 episodes, just like that, up and away the series went and was no more. The Soulkinds would eventually sue Warner Brothers over breach of their licensing agreement, and a settlement wouldn't be reached until 2005. So this leads to another big question. Why did Superboy become a forgotten series? Well, as CBR.com puts it, due to legal issues between Viacom, Warner Brothers and the Soulkinds, the show was not allowed to have reruns in the following years after its original broadcast, nor could any episodes of Superboy be released on home video. Yeah, this dispute really screwed the show. And so, as time went by, kids who watched this show growing up had nothing to remind them of the show, and so it just faded out, slowly but surely becoming a distant memory. And of course, as time went further, Smallville came out, which was a new show focusing on young Clark Kent, which rendered the previous Superboy show null and void. Yep, kids who grew up watching and loving the Superboy TV series may have seen him go up against many supervillains, but ultimately it was a whole heap of legal, squabbling mumbo-jumbo that would defeat the character. So, jump to 2006 and Superman Returns is released. And to celebrate and cash in on the Superman brand, Warner Bros. Released a heap of Superman-related media on DVD, including the 1950s Adventures of Superman TV series and the as-mentioned Lois and Clark, as well as re-releases of the Christopher Reeve Superman films. And upon this release package, the first season of Superboy was released. Now, apparently it was intended to subsequently release the other seasons of Superboy on DVD, but due to poor sales of Season 1, the idea of releasing the subsequent seasons was scrapped, and a lot of fans were upset, because they felt that Season 1 was the weaker season, which is probably why it didn't sell too well, and that true fans would love to own Season 2, 3 and 4. Hey, you guys should think yourselves lucky. Here in Australia, we didn't even get Season 1 on DVD, and still to this day, in this part of the world, no Superboy home media has ever been released here. All we have is just imports from the US. However, Gerard Christopher, bless his heart, had the masters of the Superboy Seasons 2, 3 and 4, and heard the fan outcry for those seasons, and so he started selling bootleg copies. Until, I guess, Warner Bros. Saw its worth after all, and got their hands on the masters of those seasons, and finally released those seasons officially. But not until 2012, 20 years after the show originally wrapped up. I feel like the Superboy series never got its fair dues. It was an extremely fun program, and it was well acted, had fascinating storylines which stretched the bounds of the imagination, and featured two great Superboys. I feel like it suffered due to circumstances surrounding it, and thanks to legal issues, it could never fully take off and find life and appreciation beyond its original broadcasts. I say that if you're a Superman fan, then check out the Superboy TV series. Yes, it may look dated, cheap, and cheesy now, but just go in with the understanding of this show is in the same style and presentation as the old Mighty Morphin Power Rangers TV show. And I think once you know that's the kind of thing to expect, you'll get it. It honestly is a classic series, one loved and cherished by the young, and, well, as they say, the young at heart. Seriously, I can't really praise this TV show enough, and I really do hope that its appreciation grows. Now, could it be that I'm viewing this show with rose-tinted glasses, as it's a show that I grew up with and loved as a kid? Well, yeah, that's possible, yeah. But I think that if Superman enthusiasts can go back and watch the George Reeves Superman TV show, or Lois and Clark, then they probably will find some Kryptonian hidden treasure with the Superboy TV show. Anyway, I'm Minty, and justice for the Superboy TV show. See ya!